Most people today find it hard to imagine a world without aircraft. But there are some, like me, who can, because it has all happened within a lifetime. 50 years ago, the Royal Flying Corps was formed, and now its successor, the Royal Air Force, has been celebrating its half-century. Here are some of the early aircraft that still survive, such as this Blériot, and here I am making a sentimental pilgrimage to see them. Many pilots of these early days learned to fly on this Blackburn monoplane, fitted with the first really successful rotary engine, the 50 horsepower Gnome. Here, in an anniversary display at Upavon, is the same type of plane as that in which Louis Blériot flew the English Channel in 1909, and proved to Britain that she was no longer an island. On this flight, a submarine lookout man hailed his captain with an undisciplined shout, "Look, sir, there's a man in the sky." These old planes had a top speed of not more than about 40 miles an hour, and the highest they could fly was perhaps 1,000 feet. What a difference from the jet planes of today, from the Comet, which flies at more than 500 miles an hour and cruises comfortably at 35,000 feet. The Central Flying School was formed at Upavon in June 1912 and was the original training ground of British military pilots. There is still on the wall a roll of the pilots on the establishment of the Royal Flying Corps just before the First World War broke out. These were the uniforms the airmen and airwomen wore, a mixture of Army and Navy, and some ideas of the struggling new service. One of the most popular trainers ever built was the Avro 504. It must have been flown by a high proportion of the 30,000 pilots who learned to fly before the end of the First World War. The first model, which I flew in 1913, had no lateral control except by kicking the rudder. The Sopwith Pup, the sweetest little aircraft I have ever flown. It floated through the sky like a piece of thistledown. But since it was armed with only one gun, it was not a war winner. But it still flies on occasions such as this to thrill a jet-age crowd. The Falcon Rolls-Royce engine fitted to the Bristol fighter was probably the first to embody a reduction gear, so that the propeller turned more slowly than the engine. This made for efficiency, but the first models were sealed by the makers, so that the RFC mechanics should not interfere with them. But in the field, it was not always possible to telephone to the Rolls-Royce works at Derby for help when something went wrong. After all, by the end of the Kaiser's War, there were 300,000 mechanics in the Royal Flying Corps, and many were very good technicians. This was our best rearward defense in a two-seater, a movable ring that carried 1 or 2 Lewis machine guns. There were no parachutes in those days, except in our balloons and in the German Air Force. The SE-5 was probably the most successful fighter designed by the Royal Aircraft Factory at Farnborough. One morning in 1918, a squadron of these aircraft bagged more than a score of enemy planes before breakfast. The Hart, a general-purpose reconnaissance bomber, came into service in the early 30s. I used one for years to fly about England and India. Speeds were creeping up. This plane would do about 140 miles an hour. This Gloucester Gladiator was the last successful biplane fighter in the Royal Air Force, a delightful machine to fly, but already out of date when the Hitler War started. However, 3 Gladiators at Malta, nicknamed Faith, Hope and Charity, made history in the days when the island was under continuous attack and the convoys somehow had to get through. To the boys of today, they may look like museum pieces, but in their time, they were the last word. The Swordfish torpedo bomber, the famous string bag of the Second World War, was handed over to the Navy in 1937 and later played a great part in the Sea War. By 1936, the Royal Air Force, which had been allowed to run down, had grown to some 1,500 pilots and about 30,000 airmen. By 1945, it was to number 1.25 million men and women. In the offing were these new aircraft that were to save Britain in 1940, the Hurricane and the Spitfire. Now, take a look at some of the RAF planes of today. Here come the Shackletons, the mainstay of coastal command. Maids of all work, cooperating with the Navy, helping the Meteorological Office, and rescuing distressed mariners from the hungry sea. The Shackletons were developed from the Lincoln heavy bomber, whose predecessors, the 2-engined Wellington, Whitley and Hampden, and the 4-engined Stirling, Halifax and Lancaster, carried the war to Hitler's Germany. Here comes the Vulcan. With the Valiant that follows, and the Victor, it forms the pattern of the jet-engine V-bomber force, carrying nuclear power and Britain's present deterrent. For defense, here is the Lightning, a land-based supersonic jet fighter. And here are the Navy's Sea Vixens, which fly from carriers. Now, what about the future? We are in the age of rocketcraft and of planes that need no runway to land or take off. Here is one of them. In 50 years, we have spanned 1 million ages in which man was earthbound. We are on the verge of space travel, and already man can orbit the Earth for days on end. Will he travel to the moon? To the other planets before the 20th century ends? I see nothing to stop him.